He thought he was living alone in the forest for years, but there was an alien woman watching him. 7 years. 2,555 days, if he'd kept count correctly, which Elias doubted given that he'd started carving marks into a tree trunk and stopped somewhere around day 400 when he realized he was essentially vandalizing his only companion. The forest didn't seem to mind, though. The trees on Terra 9 had bark that hummed when rain approached, a feature that had saved him from pneumonia more times than he cared to admit. He stood now at the edge of his clearing, watching the morning light filter through the canopy in shafts of gold and green. His solar collectors, salvaged from the wreckage of the transport vessel that had unceremoniously dumped him here, blinked their happy little green lights, confirming that yes, he'd have power for another day. Small victories. He'd learned to celebrate those. "Good morning, Gerald," he said to the nearest tree, a massive specimen with bioluminescent moss climbing its trunk like a glowing ladder. "Sleep well? I had that dream again. You know the one. Where I'm eating actual bread. With butter. Remember butter, Gerald?" "No, of course you don't. You're a tree." The absurdity of his life hit him at odd moments. Here he was, a former logistics coordinator for the Outer Colonies Supply Corps, chatting with trees on a moon that probably wasn't even on the official charts. His ship had malfunctioned during what should have been a routine jump, spitting him out in this uncharted system like a watermelon seed. The crash had been spectacular, he'd give himself that. The crater was still visible if you climbed to the ridge, a testament to his complete failure at piloting. Elias moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Check the collectors. Inspect the vegetable garden, scraggly things grown from seeds he'd salvaged, but they produced something vaguely edible. Refill the water containers from the stream that burbled with a musical quality that suggested the rocks themselves were somehow alive. On Terra 9, that wasn't as far-fetched as it sounded. The forest was waking around him. Creatures that looked almost but not quite like birds began their morning calls, sounds that his translator had long since given up trying to interpret. They probably weren't even communication, just noise. Like him talking to Gerald. The thought made him smile grimly. He'd stopped searching for rescue after the 3rd year. The math was simple and brutal. He'd been off course, his distress beacon had died with the ship's main power core, and the outer colonies had bigger problems than one missing supply coordinator. He'd made peace with it, more or less. Some days more, some days less. Today felt like a less day. Elias returned to his shelter being a generous term for the structure he'd built from ship panels and local timber, and sat heavily on the bench he'd carved from a fallen log. The forest stretched around him in every direction, beautiful and indifferent. 7 years of solitude did strange things to a mind. He'd read that somewhere, back when he had things to read. Now he just had his thoughts, which was significantly less entertaining. "Maybe I should get a pet," he mused aloud, because silence felt oppressive today. "Something small. Something that won't eat me. Are there any creatures here that won't eat me, Gerald?" "Survey says, unclear." The day progressed with familiar monotony. He repaired a section of his shelter's roof where the local equivalent of rain, slightly luminescent and oddly warm, had worn through. He checked his traps and found nothing, which was normal. He'd never quite figured out what the local fauna found appealing as bait. He ate a meal of roasted tubers and something that might have been a mushroom or might have been a very optimistic parasite. At this point, his stomach had adapted to things that would have hospitalized him back on Earth. As evening approached and the first hints of aurora began painting the sky in shades of silver and violet, Elias felt it. A prickling awareness at the base of his skull, a sensation like static electricity before a storm. He paused in the act of banking his fire and looked up, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows lengthening, the forest preparing for night. But the feeling persisted, stronger now. A presence. An awareness of being observed. "Hello." His voice sounded ridiculous in the vastness. "If this is me finally cracking, I'd appreciate a heads up. Maybe a memo. Dear Elias, your sanity has left the building. Signed, your brain." The forest offered no response, but something in the quality of the silence had changed. It felt occupied somehow, thick with attention. Elias's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. 7 years alone, And now this? Now his mind decided to populate his solitude with phantom watchers? He laughed, but it came out shaky. Well, he said to the darkness gathering between the trees, to Gerald, to whoever might be listening, real or imagined, if you're going to haunt me, at least make yourself useful. The firewood could use stacking. The auroras intensified overhead, their light painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Elias retreated to his shelter, but sleep felt very far away. In the darkness beyond his small circle of firelight, something watched. He was certain of it now, with a certainty that transcended logic or reason. For 7 years, he'd believed himself alone. Tonight, under the dancing lights of Terranine sky, Elias understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he might have been wrong about that. Very, very wrong. Morning arrived with the usual symphony of not-quite bird calls, but Elias had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of his shelter, listening to every snap of twig and rustle of leaves, wondering if his isolation had finally fermented into full-blown paranoia. The rational part of his brain, the part that had once filed reports and managed inventory spreadsheets, insisted he was being ridiculous. The less rational part, which had grown considerably louder over 7 years, disagreed with increasing urgency. He stumbled outside, bleary-eyed, and stopped dead. His firewood stack, which he distinctly remembered being depleted to maybe a dozen pieces, now rose in a neat pyramid of at least 40 logs. Each piece was uniform in length, stripped of excess branches, arranged with an almost architectural precision that made his own haphazard efforts look like a child's building blocks. "Okay," Elias said to the morning air, his voice cracking slightly. "Okay, that's new." He approached the woodpile as if it might explode, circling it slowly. The logs were real. Solid. Definitely not a hallucination, unless his delusions had gotten extremely detail-oriented. He picked one up, tested its weight. Perfectly dry, ideal for burning. Someone, something, had not only gathered this wood but prepared it with care. "Gerald," he called to his tree friend, "did you see who did this?" "No." "Right, because you're a tree and also probably complicit." He laughed, but it had a manic edge. "This is fine. This is completely fine. I'm either losing my mind or I have a very helpful ghost. Or a very passive-aggressive alien who judges my firewood management skills." The day took on a strange quality after that. Elias went through his routines but found himself stopping constantly, searching the forest for signs of his mysterious benefactor. He decided to run an experiment, something his scientific training insisted upon, even if that training had been limited to logistics optimization rather than xenobiology or whatever the situation required. He arranged 7 stones in a specific pattern near his water source, a simple geometric shape that couldn't occur naturally. Then he scratched marks into the dirt beside his garden, random lines that would show if anything had walked through. He even balanced a stick across his doorway in a way that would fall if the door was open from outside. "There," he announced to the forest. "Let's see you explain that away, subconscious." By midday, the sensation of being watched had intensified to the point where Elias found himself talking more than usual, which was saying something for a man who regularly debated philosophy with plant life. "Look, I don't want to be rude," he said while checking his traps, still empty as always. "But if you're going to lurk around watching me, we should at least establish some ground rules. Personal space. Privacy during bathroom breaks. The basics of not being creepy." He paused, listening. Nothing but the hum of the trees, a sound he'd learned meant stable weather ahead. "Also, if you're real and not a symptom of protein deficiency, maybe you could help with these traps? I still can't figure out what the local wildlife actually wants to eat." The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Elias caught himself glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, spinning around at phantom sounds. Once he could have sworn he saw movement in his peripheral vision, a flash of something pale between the trees, but when he looked directly there was nothing except bioluminescent moss and shadow. As evening approached, he checked his tests. The stones had been rearranged, not scattered randomly but reformed into a different pattern, a spiral that made his breath catch. The marks in the dirt showed footprints, definitely humanoid but slightly wrong in ways he couldn't immediately define. The stick across his door had fallen inward, meaning something had opened his shelter while he was away. "Right," Elias said, proud that his voice only shook a little. "So we've established you're real, you have opposable thumbs, and you understand geometry. That's actually terrifying, but let's focus on the positive. You haven't killed me yet. That's nice. I appreciate that." He rebuilt his fire as darkness gathered, the auroras beginning their nightly dance overhead. The silver light painted everything in shades of pearl and shadow, beautiful and eerie. Elias sat on his bench, holding a cup of something he optimistically called tea, and addressed the forest with as much dignity as he could muster. "All right, mysterious firewood fairy or whatever you are. I've been alone here for 7 years. 7 years. I've had conversations with trees. I've named rocks. I once spent an entire week trying to teach a lizard thing to fetch, which it absolutely did not appreciate. My point is, my standards for companionship have gotten pretty low." He took a sip of his terrible tea. "So if you want to actually introduce yourself instead of lurking around like a particularly helpful stalker, I promise I won't scream. I might scream a little, but it would be a friendly scream." The forest remained silent, but the quality of that silence felt alive now, charged with presence and possibility. Somewhere in those trees, something listened. Something that arranged stones and stacked wood and walked on humanoid feet through his camp while he was away. Elias returned to his shelter but left the door slightly ajar. On the threshold, he placed a small offering, one of his precious salvaged protein bars, only slightly expired. Next to it, he set his translator device, the one he'd given up on years ago when it proved useless for tree conversation. "Just in case you want to chat," he said to the darkness. "The welcome mat is metaphorically out." He lay on his sleeping platform, staring at the ceiling again, heart hammering with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that might have been hope. After 7 years of speaking to silence, the possibility of an answer, even from a stalker with good woodcutting skills, felt like a lifeline he hadn't known he was drowning without. Outside, the auroras painted the night silver, and in that light, Elias could have sworn he heard footsteps approaching his door. 3 nights of leaving offerings. 3 mornings of finding them gone, replaced by small tokens. A perfectly spherical stone that seemed to glow from within, a bundle of herbs that smelled like cinnamon and electricity, a carving of something that might have been a bird or might have been a ship, he couldn't quite tell. Each gift suggested intelligence, intention, and a being with far too much patience for Elias's deteriorating nerves. "This is ridiculous," he muttered on the 4th morning, stringing salvaged wire between trees with hands that shook slightly from too much terrible tea and too little sleep. "I'm setting a trap for my only social contact in 7 years. This is what my life has become. Gerald, I need you to understand that this is rock bottom." Gerald, as always, hummed noncommittally. The trap was elaborate. Probably too elaborate, but Elias's engineering background had to be useful for something besides building marginally effective shelters. He'd created a perimeter using wire from the ship's control panels, rigged to a series of bells he'd fashioned from metal scraps. Not harmful, just noisy. Impossible to cross without alerting him. If his mysterious visitor was real, they'd trigger it. If this was all psychosis, well, at least he'd have wasted time on a concrete project instead of just spiraling. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he called to the forest while testing the tension on a wire. "I just want to confirm you exist before I completely lose what's left of my mind. It's a reasonable request. Very reasonable. Extremely reasonable, even." That night, Elias positioned himself in his shelter with a clear view of the clearing, the translator device charged and ready, a light source within reach. The auroras were building to what looked like a spectacular display, sheets of silver and violet cascading across the sky with an intensity he'd rarely seen. The forest hummed its weather song, but underneath it, Elias could feel that presence again. Closer now. Watching, waiting, perhaps deciding. Hours crawled past. His eyes burned from staring into the darkness. Twice he nearly dozed off, catching himself with a jerk that sent his heart racing. The bells remained silent. Maybe his visitor had sensed the trap, decided he wasn't worth the trouble after all. Then, on what his salvaged chronometer claimed was the 4th hour past midnight, the bells sang. Not a violent crash but a delicate chiming, as if someone had brushed the wire with careful fingers and then stopped, caught. Elias lunged for his light source, his hands clumsy with adrenaline, and stumbled out of his shelter into the silver-painted night. She stood at the edge of his clearing, and every coherent thought evaporated from his mind. Humanoid, yes, but humanity filtered through something else entirely. Her skin held a pale golden luminescence that had nothing to do with the auroras overhead, as if she'd swallowed starlight and it was leaking through her pores. Hair fell past her shoulders in waves that shifted color as she moved, silver to gold to something between, like liquid metal caught in moonlight. She wore clothing that looked grown rather than sewn, organic patterns that merged with her skin in ways that suggested either very advanced technology or biology he couldn't begin to comprehend. But it was her ears that locked his gaze, elongated and tapered to elegant points, sweeping back from her skull in a way that was alien and beautiful and completely impossible according to every evolutionary model he'd ever learned. She'd frozen in his wire trap, one arm raised where the line had caught it, and she was staring at him with eyes that were too large, too dark, holding expressions that cycled too quickly for him to name. Fear, curiosity, relief, something that looked almost like grief. They stood like that for a small eternity, two beings suspended in mutual shock under the dancing lights of Terra 9's sky. Elias's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain trying and failing to produce language. She remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as if any movement might shatter whatever fragile moment this was. Finally, desperately, Elias's mind grabbed onto the only thought it could form into words. "So, you're the one who's been doing my firewood?" The absurdity of it hit him even as he said it. 7 years of isolation ending with him asking about lumber management. But something shifted in her expression, those enormous eyes widening fractionally, and then, incredibly, the corners of her mouth twitched upward. Not quite a smile. Not yet. But the beginning of one, and it transformed her face from alien to something approachable, something that suggested she understood humor even if she couldn't quite express it yet. "I'm going to." Elias gestured vaguely at the wire. "I'm going to help you out of that. Please don't run. Or vaporize me. Or whatever it is you might do. I'm very fragile and I've had a really weird week." He approached slowly, hands visible, moving like he was trying not to spook a wild animal, which wasn't far from the truth. She watched him come closer, tracking every movement with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. Up close, he could see details that defied his understanding. The way her skin seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, the geometric patterns in her irises that looked almost technological, the impossible grace in how she held herself even while trapped. His hands shook as he carefully unwound the wire from her arm. Her skin was warm under his fingers, definitely organic, definitely alive. She didn't pull away, just watched his face with that overwhelming attention that suggested she was memorizing every detail. "There," he said softly, stepping back to give her space. "You're free. You can go if you want. Or—" He swallowed hard. "Or you could stay. Maybe explain why you've been watching me. I have terrible tea. It's really bad. But I can share it." She remained still, and for a horrible moment Elias thought she'd vanish back into the forest, leaving him with more questions than answers. But then she did something that changed everything. She spoke. The language was nothing he recognized, syllables that sounded like water over stones mixed with the chiming of his bells. But she reached for the translator device hanging from his belt, and her meaning was clear. She wanted to talk. After 7 years of silence, someone wanted to talk. The translator device stuttered to life with a series of beeps that sounded apologetic, as if it knew it had been neglected for years and was embarrassed about its rusty performance. Elias held it between them like a peace offering, watching the small screen flicker through language protocols it hadn't accessed since his first week on Terra 9, back when he'd still been optimistic about finding intelligent life. She touched the device with fingers that were slightly longer than human standard, and spoke again. Those liquid syllables poured out, and the translator wheezed, processing, struggling with syntax it had never encountered. "I watch you long time," the device finally managed, its synthetic voice flat and stilted. 7 cycles. Since Sci-Fi. Since you're falling. Elias felt his knees go weak and sat down heavily on the ground, right there in the clearing. She'd been here since the crash. Since the beginning. 7 years of watching him stumble through survival, talking to trees, probably making a complete fool of himself. "You've been watching me for 7 years," he said slowly, testing the words. That's either incredibly dedicated or deeply concerning. "I haven't decided which yet." She tilted her head, those elongated ears shifting with emotion, and he realized she was waiting for the translator to process his words. When it did, something flickered across her face that might have been amusement. "Both," the translator said after she spoke. "Dedicated, concerning, both true." Despite everything, the strangeness, the fear, the complete appending of his reality, Elias laughed. It burst out of him unexpectedly, edged with hysteria but genuine. She'd made a joke. Or at least understood his attempt at one. "Okay," he said, wiping his eyes. "Okay, we're starting well. I'm Elias. Human. Former logistics coordinator. Current hermit. Professional tree conversationalist." He gestured to himself with exaggerated formality. "And you are." She touched the translator again, and when she spoke her name, the device couldn't quite capture it. The sound came out as a musical phrase that the synthesizer approximated as Sarai, but Elias could tell something was lost in translation. "Sarai," he repeated, probably butchering it. "That's beautiful. Much better than Gerald." He pointed at his tree friend. "That's Gerald. I named him. He's not great at conversation, but he's a good listener." The translator processed this, and Sarai's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like gentle confusion mixed with what could only be described as fondness. "You speak trees," the translator said. "I know. I hear all speaking. 7 cycles." The implications of that crashed over Elias like a wave. Every conversation with himself, every moment of vulnerability, every time he'd broken down or celebrated small victories or sang off-key while working, she'd witnessed all of it. His face burned with embarrassment. "Oh no," he said. "Oh no, you heard everything. The singing. The crying. That week I tried to make alcohol from tubers and mostly just poisoned myself. The time I had a full argument with myself about whether rocks have feelings." Sarai moved then, lowering herself to sit across from him in the grass with a grace that suggested different gravity in her evolutionary history. She spoke, and the translator worked faster now, adapting to her patterns. "You're speaking, not boring," it said. "You're speaking, make watching easier. Make duty become more." "Duty," Elias repeated, latching onto the word. "So you were assigned to watch me? Like a guard? A scientist? Please tell me you're not writing a paper called 7 Years Observing a Human Male's Descent into Madness." She made a sound that the translator didn't even attempt to interpret, but Elias would have bet his last protein bar it was laughter. When she spoke again, her words came more fluidly, and the translator seemed to find its rhythm. "My people live deep forest. We saw your sky fire. Your falling machine. Big danger sign. We debate, show ourselves, or hide." She paused, and those dark eyes found his with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "I say, I watch. I keep safe. I make sure. No harm to forest. No harm from forest." "So you've been my bodyguard," Elias said. "My very patient, very quiet bodyguard who never once introduced herself while I was having conversations with plant life." "At first, only duty," Sarai said through the device. "Watch strange sky faller. Make sure. No danger. But you." She struggled with something, her fingers dancing over the translator as if trying to coax out meaning it didn't have words for. "You treat forest kind. You speak to trees like friends. You fix things. Build careful. Not take too much. You lonely. I hear lonely in voice. Every day." Something in Elias's chest cracked open. 7 years of solitude, and someone had been listening. Not just observing, but hearing. The loneliness he'd tried so hard to joke away, to rationalize, to accept, she'd witnessed all of it. "I was lonely," he admitted quietly. "I am lonely. Talking to Gerald helps, but he's terrible at responding." He looked at her, this impossible being with starlight skin and ancient eyes. "Why now? Why finally show yourself?" Sarai was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, the translator's flat voice couldn't diminish the emotion in her words. "Because what you call too empty, every night, become too heavy. Cannot let you think alone anymore. You never alone. Never. I always here." The auroras pulsed overhead, painting them both in silver light. Elias felt tears prickling his eyes and didn't bother hiding them. 7 years of believing himself abandoned, and all along someone had been there. Watching, yes, but also caring. Protecting. Bearing witness to his existence. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "For the firewood. For watching. For being here. Even when I didn't know it." Sarai reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and placed something in his palm. It was a small carved figure. Himself, unmistakably, rendered in wood with such detail that he could see the patches on his clothes, the way his hair stuck up in the morning. She'd made this. Had been watching him closely enough to capture him perfectly. "You never alone," she repeated softly. "Now, you know." Elias closed his fingers around the carving, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility and presence, and the strange new reality that loneliness had been an illusion all along. Dawn broke over Terra 9 with Elias and Sarai still sitting in the clearing, the translator device between them having facilitated the strangest and most wonderful conversation of his life. They'd talked through the night, or rather, Elias had talked and asked questions while Sarai answered with increasing fluency as the translator learned her language patterns. He'd learned that her people called themselves something the device rendered as the Rooted Ones, which Sarai admitted sounded better in her tongue, and that they'd inhabited Terra 9 for longer than their oral histories could track. "So when you say your people are part of the forest," Elias said, nursing his terrible morning tea while Sarai examined the cup with obvious fascination, "you mean that metaphorically, right? Like, spiritually connected." Sarai took the translator and spoke, then gestured to the trees around them. "No. Real connected. We share roots. Share signals. Trees talk. We listen. We talk. Trees listen." Elias blinked. "You're telling me the trees are actually communicating? The humming I've been hearing for 7 years isn't just weather prediction, it's actual language." "Yes," the translator said simply. "Forest is one mind. Many bodies. We grow inside it. Part of it. That's..." Elias set down his tea before he dropped it. "That's incredible. That's the most incredible thing I've ever heard, and I once watched a ship's drive core fold space incorrectly and turn a cargo container inside out." He looked at the trees with new eyes, at Gerald standing faithful and patient at the clearing's edge. "Gerald, you've been understanding me this whole time? Why didn't you say something? We could have been having actual conversations." Sarai made that sound again, definitely laughter, he was certain now, and the translator managed to convey her amusement. "Trees, slow talkers. One word. Maybe one season." Gerald, probably still thinking about, "First thing you say, 7 years ago." "What did I say 7 years ago?" "You say, I'm going to die here." Elias winced. "Well, that's depressing. Poor Gerald's been processing my existential crisis for 7 years. No wonder he never responded." Over the following days, Sarai began showing him the forest he thought he'd known. It was like being given new senses. She taught him to place his palm flat against the bark and feel the slow pulse of communication running through the wood. Not quite electrical, not quite biological, something in between that his instruments had never detected because they weren't designed to look for consciousness in plant life. "Your scanners look for fast," Sarai explained while guiding his hand to a particularly ancient tree. "Look for quick thinking. But forest thinks slow, deep. Your machines, too impatient." The network she showed him was vast and intricate. Root systems that connected every tree in a radius of kilometers, sharing nutrients, sharing information, sharing something that might have been memory. The bioluminescent moss wasn't just decoration. It was part of the communication system, lighting up in patterns that conveyed meaning to those who could read it. It's like a planet-wide nervous system, Elias breathed, watching the moss pulse in waves across the canopy. You're living inside a giant distributed brain. We not inside it, Sarai corrected gently. We part of it, like you not inside your body. You, our body. The philosophical implications made his head spin, but what amazed him more was how patient she was with his questions, his clumsy attempts to understand, and how she seemed equally fascinated by him, by his technology, his survival methods, the concept of a species that traveled between stars and metal ships instead of growing with the worlds they inhabited. Your people, very loud, she observed one afternoon while watching him repair a solar panel. Build loud, think loud, move loud. Must be tiring. It is actually, Elias admitted. That's why I liked logistics. Quiet job. Just numbers and efficiency. The universe made sense in spreadsheets. He laughed at himself. Though I guess the universe had other plans. Threw me at a forest moon and said, "Figure it out." Universe, not throw you, Sarai said, and something in her tone made him look up. Universe, bring you. To here. To me. The moment stretched between them, loaded with meaning the translator couldn't quite capture. Elias felt his face warm and covered it with humor, as always. Well, the universe has a weird sense of timing. 7 years is a long wait for an introduction. Some things worth waiting for. He had no response to that, so he focused on his solar panel and tried to ignore how his hands had started shaking slightly. The cultural exchanges went both ways, often with comedic results. Sarai was baffled by his insistence on wearing boots. Ground is speaking. You cover ears for feet, while Elias couldn't wrap his mind around her people's practice of singing to their food before consuming it. It's thanking, she explained while demonstrating with one of his salvaged vegetables. The sound she made was haunting, melodic, nothing like human music. Food gave life, was alive. We honor sacrifice. That's actually beautiful, Elias said. Also makes me feel guilty about every meal I've complained about for 7 years. Your food probably forgive you. It not very good food. He stared at her. Did you just insult my cooking? I watch you eat for 7 years, Sarai said, and the translator somehow conveyed smugness. Your face. Always say truth. Food. Not good. Elias burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the forest. Okay, fair. It's terrible. I'm a terrible cook. But in my defense, I'm working with limited ingredients and no seasoning except regret. She moved closer then, close enough that he could see the patterns in her luminescent skin shifting like slow currents. Tomorrow, I show you real food. Forest food. Food that tastes good. Are you offering to cook for me? Offering to teach you, so you stop suffering. Sarai, I take back every creepy thing I said about you watching me. You're clearly a hero. That night, sitting by his fire with Sarai perched nearby on a log, she didn't sit quite like humans did, he'd noticed. Her spine had a different flexibility. Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Not just the absence of loneliness, but its opposite. Connection. Companionship. The simple comfort of another being who knew him, who'd seen him at his worst and chose to stay anyway. Can I ask you something? He said quietly. Sarai tilted her head, those elongated ears catching the firelight. Yes. All those years of watching. Was it just duty? Or was there another reason? She was silent for so long that Elias thought maybe he'd overstepped, pushed too far too fast. But then she spoke, and the translator's voice was soft with something that transcended language. At first, only duty. But you You were kind to Forest. Kind to yourself, even when hurting. You made me curious. Then made me care. Then. She paused. Then, stopping watching became impossible. Not because must watch. Because want to watch. Want to know strange skyfaller who talks to trees and makes them almost answer. Elias's chest felt too full, too tight. I'm glad you stayed, he managed. I'm glad you finally said hello. I, too, Sarai said, and when she smiled, really smiled, not just the beginning of one, it transformed her alien features into something radiant. The forest hummed around them, Gerald and his brethren sharing their slow thoughts, and Elias understood that he'd never been alone. The forest had been alive all along, and Sarai had been its voice, watching over him until the moment was right to bridge the gap between silence and speech. 3 months passed like water through Elias's fingers, each day blurring into the next in the best possible way. The crash site on the ridge had long since been reclaimed by Terra 9's aggressive vegetation, vines climbing through the wreckage until his former prison looked more like a metal skeleton being digested by the forest. He'd stopped climbing up to look at it weeks ago. There was nothing up there he wanted anymore. Sarai had introduced him to her people with all the careful diplomacy of a first contact specialist, though Elias suspected his reputation had preceded him thanks to the forest's communication network. The rooted ones emerged from the deeper woods in small groups, cautious and curious in equal measure. They ranged in age from younglings barely taller than his knee to elders whose skin held the deep golden patina of centuries. All of them had those elegant tapered ears, that same luminescent quality, and a grace that made Elias feel like he was perpetually stumbling through life in comparison. There, staring, he whispered to Sarai during his first formal meeting with the elders, a gathering held in a grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle and the moss painted constellations on the bark. You, strange, she said through the translator, which had become so attuned to her speech patterns it now captured nuance and tone. Skyfaller who talks to trees. Who Sarai watches. For 7 years. They, curious why. That makes 2 of us, Elias muttered, then louder to the assembled elders. Thank you for allowing me to stay in your forest. I promise I've been trying not to break anything important. The eldest among them, a woman whose name the translator rendered as Deep Root, spoke with a voice like wind through canyons. The one who watches the skyfaller speaks much of you. Says you treat the forest as kin. This is unusual for the loud ones who travel stars. I didn't have much choice, Elias admitted. It was either learn to live with the forest or die very quickly. The forest was patient with me. More patient than I deserved. The forest says, you speak to it. Daily. 4-7 cycles. I was lonely, Elias said simply. When you're alone, you either talk to something or you forget how to talk at all. I chose talking. Even if I thought nothing was listening. The forest was listening, Deeproot said, and something in her expression softened. The forest told Sarai. Told all of us. Skyfaller with sad voice. Skyfaller who asks permission. Who says thank you to trees. Who mourns when he must cut wood for fire. She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that held the weight of centuries. Sarai's watching became more than duty. We saw this. We approved. Elias glanced at Sarai, who had suddenly become very interested in a patch of moss near her feet, her skin flickering through shades of gold that might have been the rooted one's equivalent of blushing. I'm glad she revealed herself, Elias said carefully. I was starting to think I'd actually lost my mind. Perhaps you did, Deeproot said, and the other elders made sounds that might have been laughter. Perhaps finding mind again required someone to look for it with you. The integration wasn't without its awkward moments. Elias's attempts to navigate Rooted One's social customs resulted in several minor disasters, including accidentally insulting someone's ancestral tree by leaning against it wrong and somehow proposing a business merger when he'd meant to ask for gardening advice. The translator could only do so much, and cultural context was still being established through trial and mostly error. Your people are very polite about me being a complete idiot, he told Sarai after the merger incident, which she found unreasonably hilarious. They think you charming, she said. Like watching youngling learn to walk. You fall down much. But keep trying. They respect trying. I'm so glad my incompetence is endearing. But slowly, steadily, he found his place. The rooted ones taught him which plants were edible, actual food, not the survival rations he'd been choking down, and how to ask the forest's permission before harvesting. He taught them about human technology, jury-rigging his solar panels to provide light for their evening gatherings, creating tools that merged their organic approach with his mechanical knowledge. His shelter expanded with their help, incorporating living wood that grew to his specifications, merging human habitation with forest architecture until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "You're settling," Sarai observed one evening as they sat together watching the auroras paint the sky. The translator sat and used between them now. They developed their own hybrid communication, part language, part gesture, part something deeper that didn't need words. "I am," Elias agreed. "Is that okay? Am I allowed to stop waiting for rescue?" "Were you still waiting?" He thought about it, really thought. The distress beacon had been dead for years. The outer colonies had probably declared him lost with all hands, filed the appropriate paperwork, moved on. Earth was dozens of light years away, and even if someone came looking, what would they find? A crashed ship consumed by vegetation and a human who'd gone native in an alien forest. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I've been waiting for a while now. I just didn't realize I'd stopped." Sarai moved closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. Her warmth was different from human warmth, carried something electric and alive that he'd learned was the forest's pulse running through her veins. "Good. Because I not want you to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Elias said softly. "Where would I go? Everything I need is here. Everything I—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Say," Sarai encouraged gently. "Everyone I care about is here," he finished. Gerald. Deeproot and her terrible jokes about my posture. This whole impossible forest that I spent 7 years talking to without knowing it was talking back. He turned to look at her, this alien woman with starlight skin and ancient eyes who'd watched over him through his loneliest years. "You watched me for 7 years. You protected me. You knew everything about me before I knew you existed. That should be terrifying, but it's not. It's the most incredible gift anyone's ever given me." Gift. Sarai's ears tilted forward, a sign of confusion he'd learned to read. "Witness," Elias clarified. "You witnessed my life when I thought no one ever would again. You made sure I was never really alone, even when I thought I was. That's a gift. The best gift." Sarai was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, she didn't use the translator. The words were in her language, melodic and complex, but he understood them anyway through the context of her expression, her posture, the way the forest itself seemed to lean in to listen. She was telling him she cared. More than duty, more than curiosity. Something that transcended species and circumstance, growing slowly like the trees around them but no less real for its patience. "I know," Elias said, and meant it. "I care too. I think I have for a while. I just didn't know you were real enough to care about." The auroras intensified overhead, silver and violet cascading across the sky in waves that the rooted ones claimed were the forest's dreams made visible. Elias thought maybe they were right. Maybe this whole moon dreamed, and maybe he'd crashed into that dream and become part of it. He'd stopped being a human surviving in an alien forest. Somewhere along the way, without noticing the exact moment of transformation, he'd become something else. Something new. A skyfaller who learned to root, a loud one who learned to listen, a lonely man who discovered that loneliness had been an illusion all along. "Gerald," he called softly to his tree friend, standing patient in the darkness. "Thanks for listening all those years. I know you're still processing my first existential crisis, but when you finish, know that it worked out okay in the end." The tree hummed, that deep resonance he'd learned meant contentment, and the moss on its bark pulsed with gentle light. Sarai laughed, the sound mixing with the forest's song, and Elias thought that this moment This place, this impossible life he'd stumbled into, was worth every day of loneliness that had led him here. He'd lost everything when his ship crashed, but somehow, in losing everything, he'd found more than he'd ever known to look for. The forest breathed around them, alive and aware, and Elias breathed with it, finally home. The end.